At 6:30 that morning, my sister called to tell me our father had died, and before she finished saying funeral, I heard Daddy's voice behind me asking, "Who is that?" I turned so quickly I nearly spilled my coffee. My 84-year-old father was standing in my kitchen wearing his old gray robe, holding the chipped mug he'd used every morning for decades. On the phone, Carol went silent. Not shocked, not confused, silent. Then she said, "Margaret, you need to listen to me. Daddy died in his sleep last night. Don't come to the funeral. I'll handle everything." I looked at Daddy. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke until the call ended. My name is Margaret Lawson, and I lived in a small Tennessee town where people still waved from pickup trucks and neighbors knew when something wasn't right. Daddy had lived alone since Mama died 6 years earlier, but I checked on him almost every day. Carol lived 40 miles away and visited when she could, though lately her visits had become more frequent and strangely businesslike. She had started collecting Daddy's bank statements, asking about his pension, and reminding me that his house was worth considerably more than it used to be. Whenever I questioned her, she smiled and said, "I'm just trying to help." I let that one pass. I wasn't born yesterday, but I also wasn't looking for trouble inside my own family. That morning, trouble had apparently found me anyway. Daddy sat at my kitchen table while the old coffee maker hummed in rain, tapped against the windows. I called Carol back, straight to voicemail. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Daddy's attorney, Walter Simmons. "Is your father with you?" he asked. "Yes." His voice lowered. "Then keep him there. Your sister came to my office yesterday, demanding a copy of his new will." I refused. Daddy's face changed when he heard that. He reached into his robe pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Walter told me to keep this somewhere safe," he said. Inside was a letter dated 2 days earlier, confirming that Daddy had changed his estate plan after discovering unexplained activity involving his finances. I read the final sentence twice. "If my daughter Carol tells anyone I have died, do not accept her explanation without first checking my bank records." I looked at Daddy. He looked toward the window. Then he quietly asked me one question. "Margaret, what did Carol tell you about the money?" I hadn't mentioned money to Daddy because, until that moment, I didn't know what he meant. "She told me nothing," I said. Daddy looked down at his hands. "Then we need to find out why." He didn't sound frightened. He sounded tired. The way a man sounds when something he has suspected for months has finally become impossible to ignore. We drove to his house that afternoon, taking the long county road past soybean fields and weathered barns. Carol had been there the previous evening, according to a neighbor, and I wanted to see what she'd left behind. Daddy unlocked the front door himself. Nothing appeared disturbed. The living room looked exactly as it always had, with Mama's framed photograph above the mantel and Daddy's recliner, facing the television, but on the kitchen counter sat an envelope I hadn't seen before. Daddy opened it and found a photocopy of a bank statement. A withdrawal of $18,500 had been made from his savings account. 3 weeks earlier, Daddy stared at it. I didn't take this. I looked at the transaction details. The withdrawal had been made at a branch nearly an hour away. Daddy rarely drove beyond town anymore, and that particular day he had been at his doctor's office. I asked whether Carol had access to the account. He hesitated before answering. "I added her last year. She said it would make things easier if I ever got sick." That sentence stayed with me. We searched his desk and found several more statements. Another withdrawal, then another. Together, they totaled more than $41,000. My first instinct was to call Carol, but Daddy stopped me. "No, let her think we know nothing." I looked at him. "Daddy, why would you say that?" He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were dates, amounts, and brief notes written in his handwriting. For months, he'd been recording every unusual transaction he'd noticed. He had also written down the names of people who had called him asking questions about his property. One name appeared repeatedly: Carol's friend Frank Dillard, a retired bookkeeper who had once handled payroll for Daddy's small construction business. I had known Frank for years, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him. Daddy turned one page and pointed to a sentence written in blue ink. "Frank says Carol wants me declared incompetent." I felt the room go still. Before I could ask what he meant, Daddy's phone rang. The caller ID showed Carol. he answered on speaker. Her voice was trembling. "Daddy, please don't go to the bank tomorrow." Daddy looked at me. "Why?" There was a long silence. Then Carol whispered, "Because they'll ask you about the withdrawal I made yesterday." I watched Daddy's expression change when Carol admitted the withdrawal. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "How much?" Carol started crying. "Daddy, I was going to explain." "How much, Carol?" He repeated. Finally, she said, 30,000. Daddy closed his eyes. I could hear rain beginning again against the kitchen windows. "That isn't the amount you took yesterday," he said. Carol went silent. My stomach tightened. Daddy had been keeping records, and now he knew the numbers better than she realized. "I took care of some bills," Carol finally said. "You wouldn't understand." Daddy's voice remained steady. "Then explain them." She couldn't. Instead, she told him he was confused and needed to stop letting me influence him. I let that one pass too. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided. The truth was inconvenient. Daddy ended the call and immediately phoned his bank. The manager confirmed that 3 withdrawals had been made using Carol's authorized access. One was for 18,500s, another was for 11,200s. The third, made the previous day, was for $30,000. None had supporting invoices or legitimate transfers attached. Daddy asked the bank to freeze Carol's access and preserve every transaction record. Then we went to Mr. Simmons's office. His office smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and the ceiling fan clicked overhead as he studied the documents. He wasn't surprised by the withdrawals. What surprised him was something else. "Your father signed a new will 2 days before the first large withdrawal," he said. Daddy nodded. "And I made one other?" "Change." Mr. Simmons opened a folder and showed me a notarized document. Daddy had removed Carol as beneficiary of his investment account and placed the funds into a trust for his grandchildren. I looked at him. "Did Carol know?" "She knew I was changing something," Daddy said. "She didn't know what." Suddenly, Carol's strange behavior made more sense. She hadn't been protecting Daddy's finances. She had been protecting what she believed would become hers. But Mr. Simmons wasn't finished. He pulled out another document. It was a copy of a medical statement submitted to the county, claiming Daddy was mentally incapable of managing his affairs. The physician's name was genuine. The signature looked genuine. Yet Daddy stared at it and shook his head. "That doctor never examined me." Mr. Simmons leaned closer. "Then we have a serious problem." He pointed to the date. The statement had been signed the day after Daddy changed his will. I looked at Daddy, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen that morning. Fear. Then Mr. Simmons quietly added, "Margaret, there's one more. Name on this filing. And it's someone your father knows very well." Mr. Simmons turned the document around and tapped the witness line with his finger. The name was Frank Dillard. Daddy leaned back in his chair, as though someone had opened an old wound. "I knew it," he whispered. Frank had worked for Daddy years ago, keeping the books for his construction business before retiring. I remembered him as a quiet man who always smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. "Why would Frank sign a medical statement?" I asked. Mr. Simmons shook his head. "That's what we need to find out." The next morning, Daddy and I drove to Frank's house. His mailbox leaned beside a gravel driveway, and a pickup truck sat beneath an old carport. Frank opened the door after several knocks. When he saw Daddy, his face drained of color. "I suppose you know," he said. Daddy didn't answer. I stepped forward. "We know about the withdrawals. We know about the competency statement. We know your name is on it." Frank looked toward the kitchen and then lowered his voice. "Come inside." We sat around his small dining table, while an old refrigerator hummed nearby. Frank admitted Carol had approached him months earlier. She told him Daddy was becoming confused and that she was trying to protect his property. At first, Frank believed her. She asked him to help organize Daddy's finances and promised to pay him for his time. Then the request changed. She wanted him to help move money between accounts. She wanted copies of Daddy's signatures. And after Daddy changed his will, she asked Frank to sign the competency statement. "Why did you do it?" I asked. Frank stared at his hands. "Because Carol told me your father had already been examined. She said the doctor's office had approved everything." "And the money?" Daddy asked. Frank swallowed. "She promised me 20,000. dollars after your house was sold." Daddy didn't move. I could see the disappointment in his face. But he didn't insult Frank. He simply said, "You knew better." Frank nodded. Then he reached beneath the table and produced a folder. I kept copies because I got scared. Inside were bank instructions, handwritten notes, and messages from Carol. One note contained a list of tasks: secure the accounts, establish incompetency, sell the house, and make sure Margaret stayed away. My name was written at the bottom, but one line stopped me cold. It said, "Do this before Dad realizes what Margaret found in Mama's old files." I looked at Daddy. "What files?" His face changed completely. He stood, walked to Frank's cabinet, and pulled out an old photograph. "Margaret," he said, "your mother found something before she died. I thought it was gone." Then Frank quietly added, "Carol knows exactly where it is." I didn't ask Daddy what Mama had found until we were back in his kitchen, with the afternoon sun falling across the table where she had once sorted coupons and paid bills. He opened an old cedar box and removed several folders tied with faded string. Mama had kept everything: property records, insurance papers, bank statements, and handwritten notes. Near the bottom, Daddy found a copy of an old partnership agreement from his construction business. Frank had once owned a small share, but Daddy had bought him out years ago. Then we found the document Mama had been searching for. It showed that Frank had quietly remained responsible for a small unpaid business debt, one Carol had apparently discovered. She had promised to erase that debt if Frank helped her gain control of Daddy's money and property. Suddenly, the strange withdrawals, the false medical statement, and the fake death announcement all fit together. Carol hadn't simply wanted Daddy's inheritance. She needed Daddy declared incompetent before he discovered what she had been doing. Mr. Simmons gathered every document, including Frank's written statement, the bank records, the medical office confirmation, and the messages proving Carol's plan. Daddy filed a formal complaint, and the county court reviewed the evidence. Carol's attorney tried to argue that she had been acting out of concern for our father, but the records told a different story. The bank transactions had dates. The medical office had records. Frank had his copies. Daddy had his own handwritten notebook. And most importantly, Daddy was sitting right there, perfectly capable of explaining every decision he had made. The court removed Carol's financial authority, ordered the unauthorized money returned, and rejected the competency filing. Because the evidence showed deliberate deception, the matter was referred for further legal review. Carol never went to jail in some dramatic television ending, and I wouldn't have wanted that. What happened instead was quieter. She lost the trust of the people who had once defended her. At church, conversations stopped when she approached. Neighbors who had once invited her for supper no longer called. Daddy eventually forgave her, though he never again gave her control over his finances. As for me, I didn't celebrate her downfall. I simply became more careful about whom I trusted. A few months later, Daddy and I sat together on his front porch while cicadas sang in the trees. He looked at me and said, "Your mother always believed family meant telling the truth when it mattered." I thought about that morning when Carol told me Daddy was dead while he was sitting behind me, alive and listening. She had tried to erase him from his own future. Instead, she gave us the warning that exposed everything. I learned that family isn't proven by blood alone. It's proven by what we do when someone we love can no longer protect themselves.